Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 95 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I've got a terrific guest for you this week, and before we get to that, a couple updates from here first. I want to make sure that you caught last week's episode. It was 94, and it was with Melissa Gould, who is the author of the new memoir, Widowish. I've gotten a bunch of comments from listeners about how much they really enjoyed that episode and how helpful that discussion was, and also how terrific her book is. So please do check out both her book and that discussion, which is episode 94. And if you are here because you became widowed from COVID, I want to make sure that you know about episode 93, which is the week before last, with Pamela Addison, who has started a Facebook group for younger COVID widows and widowers. So if that is you, or if you know somebody who might like to know about that as a resource, please direct them to episode 93. And the other thing I wanted to mention for the guys who are listening, for the widowed dads out there, because this show is most definitely not for moms only, it's for all widowed parents. And I was reminded, I heard from a listener recently who said how useful the interview I did with Justin Yop was, and especially how much he liked Justin's book. It's called The Group, 7 Widowed Fathers Reimagine Life, and I talked with him back in episode 39. He and his colleague actually started a group for widowed dads down at the University of North Carolina, and they went on to write a book about the 7 guys in their group and the experiences in their journeys. So for the widowed dads who are listening, definitely pick up that book and have a listen to my discussion with Justin. And actually, I would say that book is not only for dads. I think there's a lot of information in there about grief and parenting that's useful for everyone. And also, especially if you're a widowed dad, then it's definitely a must-read. So check that one out. And one other thing I wanted to mention, because I've done a whole bunch of interviews recently on other people's shows surrounding my book launch, which has just been terrific to talk to people. And one of the questions that hosts like to ask is what kinds of things, what are some of the top things that I've learned from the guests on this show over the past 2+ years? And it's really hard, sometimes they'll ask me, 1 or 2 things that I've learned, and it's really hard to narrow it down. And it reminded me, anyway, that I wanted to make sure you guys know about the document that I put together. I went through and I picked the top 10 things. I tried to pull together a summary of 10 of the most fundamental or important things that I'd learned so far from my guests. And that is actually available as a free download. It's at jennylisk.com/top10. And so I wanted to make sure you guys know about that, because it's really a great place to kind of get an overview of some of the most important lessons and, information that's come out of the show. Of course, I encourage you to listen to all the episodes, but I do think having that kind of summary or bigger picture view of it is also helpful. So jennylisk.com/top10 for that. Okay, let's move on to today's show. The Widowed Parent Podcast is supported by Audible, and I'm excited to say that listeners can get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial. Just go to audibletrial.com/widowedparent. That's audibletrial.com/widowedparent, and you get a free audiobook and a free 30-day trial of Audible. I hope you'll check it out. I had such a great discussion with Mira Simone for this episode. So Mira is a widowed parent, and she lives in the Toronto area, and she's a grief writer. And she actually started writing as soon as her husband was diagnosed with cancer. and she hasn't stopped. And we had such a terrific discussion about what writing has meant to her, and also about how she coped with the shock and trauma of losing her husband, and also now about solo parenting her young daughter. And we also had a really interesting discussion about the work she's done with both grief therapy and trauma therapy, and her thoughts on how that was different and why she thought she found both to be worthwhile. One of the things that I really like about interviewing other widowed parents who can reflect on their journeys is I think it helps all of us to feel a little bit less alone, to hear other people's experiences and to hear how they've dealt with the different things that have come up. Sometimes we don't know people in our own circles, our own neighborhoods, and in our own kids' schools that are in a similar situation of being widowed parents of kids or teenagers, and it's helpful, I think, to hear other people's stories. So I hope you enjoy my discussion with Mira Simone. My guest today is Mira Simone. Mira is a widowed parent and a grief writer living in Toronto, Canada. Mira, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to speaking with you for lots of reasons, including the fact that you are a grief writer, and I've been doing a lot of writing, and I'm interested in talking to you about your experience with writing and how that has helped you process your grief, but so many other things as well. So we'll get to that. But I thought, if you don't mind, I'd ask you to start off with reading a passage from an article that you wrote, and it's a publication called The Tyee, and the title of the article is "My Partner, My Love Died, So I Started Writing."
Sure. The night we found out that Brian had cancer, after he'd fallen asleep, I paced the house. My heart was racing, my breathing haggard. Then I instinctively reached for my old journal. I hadn't written anything in years, but I started writing that night. The cancer was in his brain, his bones, and multiple organs. It was everywhere. I wrote every single day after that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us.
No problem.
Before we talk more about that, can you set the stage for us a little bit? I'd love to hear about your life back when everything was normal, before your husband died. Can you tell us about your family and your life?
Yeah. Our life was wonderful. Our life was also challenging. I think there's a lot of the time when, these great tragedies happen to us, it's easy to say that, everything was perfect before, everything was great. And then all of a sudden this crazy thing happened and it all fell apart because, on one level that is true. But Brian and I, we faced a lot of challenges together in our relationship. We were together for 7 years, and within those 7 years, there was a lot of illness in our family. There was some death in our family. So we went through some grief together. So I also had experienced a little bit of grief before, more in a supporting role to him, which is really interesting to think about now. We had an amazing daughter together. We had an incredible birth experience. I had this really long home birth that was just wild, and he was my rock, and he was just incredible throughout that whole experience. We fell in love in this really beautiful, very connected, very synchronistic kind of way. And we had this really, really deep and wonderful connection. Brian was the best at really deep conversations, which just filled my cup so much, because I love getting to the meat of anything. Both of us just hated small talk. So our relationship was a lot of really deep conversations, really kind of delving into who we were. I think that I just learned so much more about myself through being in a relationship with him. And we loved being parents together. We just, I think, complemented each other really, really well in that specific way. And he taught me a lot about parenting, and I think I taught him a lot as well, and we just balanced each other out in this really beautiful way together.
Yeah, terrific. And then tell us what happened.
So Brian died of, essentially he died from melanoma because of a freckle on his cheek. So he always had a beard, and he had a freckle under the beard that he'd had from when he was a kid. And he was seeing a dermatologist because he did have a family history of melanoma, but she never asked him to shave his beard. And we never thought that he should shave his beard for any of his appointments with her. And so this freckle that was under his beard was, we don't know for how long, was growing into a melanoma. And he actually, the way that he noticed it was that he started to feel that he had this sort of just a feeling in his cheek. He could feel the mole that previously he hadn't been able to feel, right? You're not really accustomed to feeling your moles, but he said it was almost like an itch, but also like he just was aware of it. And so he went to the dermatologist, and she biopsied it, and we found out that it was melanoma, and that it was a very deep melanoma. So there was a tumor that had grown in his cheek 5.8 millimeters deep, which for a melanoma is like insanely deep. And what kind of followed was a summer of, waiting for tests, trying to find out, had it spread, had it not spread, if it had spread, how far it had spread, what is the protocol, what do we do? And there was so much waiting, and it was terrifying. But at the end of that whole summer, essentially, we had the best case scenario, which was, miraculously, it hadn't spread at all, even though for a melanoma that deep, the chances of it spreading are very great. And once melanoma has spread, it's extremely difficult. Like, it's known as one of these cancers that is extremely difficult to treat once it's spread. And it often hits really young, really healthy people. And we had this amazing best case scenario where it hadn't spread, and where he didn't need any treatments. The only protocol was to do a surgery just in case, to remove as much tissue from around the mole on his cheek, just to sort of help him out a little bit, just in case it had spread to any of the skin around the mole. So we had this surgery on his face, and we found out that there hadn't been any melanoma that had spread to any of the tissue that they'd removed. So we just felt like we had dodged a huge bullet, and we were like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
We went on to live our lives. And a year and a half later, he started having just sort of strange random symptoms. Like, initially he was having trouble. He commented, he'd always had perfect eyesight, and he started commenting that he was having trouble with reading really small print. And I was, of course, making fun of him, because I figured that he was getting old, because he was 7 years older than me. So I was like, you're going to need reading glasses. And then he started waking up in the middle of the night, and he wasn't able to sleep, and we thought it was stress. And then he started having some back pain, but he was this really tall guy. And so we figured, well, every tall men always have back pain. It's like the curse of being a tall man, right, in this world. And so we just kind of, like, all of these things just seemed kind of normal. And then he started feeling sick. Like, he started feeling like he had the flu. And that's when things really turned. So it was just like, he had this really bad flu. It wouldn't go away. And it was just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And it wasn't normal for Brian to have the flu. Like, he never got the flu the whole time I knew him. He was not the kind of person who ever got sick. I can probably count on one hand the number of times he got a cold, like, in our relationship. He was so healthy, and his back was hurting more and more and more and more and more. And he had this flu. And that's when he went to our family doctor, and she was like, do you have a CT scan coming up? And back when he'd had his surgery, they had scheduled him with yearly CT scans for 5 years. But we thought that that was just their protocol. They do that just to be safe. At least for me, it never crossed my mind that that was because there was a chance that melanoma could get into his organs. Like, I figured we were in the clear.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was living in denial. I also partly have anger towards the doctors, because no doctor ever told us that that was a possibility. So I wasn't really looking out for any of these things. And he was just getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And then our doctor ordered blood tests, and when they came back, his iron was off the charts, like dangerously high. And that's when I realized something is very, very seriously wrong. Like, this isn't just, we thought, he was going through some kind of like spiritual or emotional crisis. He was delving into all of these old wounds and things. And he was always really into this sort of like self-exploration. So we figured it was some sort of emotional or spiritual thing that he was going through. And when the iron thing came back, that's when I realized like, no, this is actually like really, really, really serious. So we ended up getting a CT scan. There was a snow day in Toronto, and we ended up getting, you know, a last minute CT scan. And he was already so sick by that point that he could barely even get dressed. I remember I get undressed in the room to get the CT scan. And the next night we were at home, and our daughter was with my parents. They had taken her for a few days, and we got an email with the results of his CT scan on a Thursday night. And he had cancer everywhere, like I read in that initial piece of writing, which I actually wrote that night. I wrote that very first night in my journal. And he had cancer in his brain. In all the reason his back was sore was because it was in his spine, it was in his shoulders, it was in his hips, it was in his neck bones, it was in multiple organs. Like it's easier for me to list the organs that it wasn't in than to list the organs that it was in.
And they told you this by email?
Yes.
Wow.
And we didn't have an appointment with the oncologist. They called me the next day. Our doctor called me the next day. Our family doctor was the first person to call me. She said, you need to go to the pharmacy and you need to get him pain medication. I cannot believe that all he's taking is Tylenol. And like, she was like very confused as to why we were not in the ER because of pain. And that's when I got so scared. And so I went, she put the prescription through. I went to get the pain meds. The oncologist called me and said, come in on Monday. I said, yes. Okay. But I had to take him to the ER that first weekend because like less than 48 hours after we got the news that he had cancer, I had to take him to the ER because he had so much fluid buildup in his abdomen that he needed to have drained. And it's called ascites. And now I know that it's an end of life symptom. But at the time I had no clue. And we went to the ER and they were like looking at his charts and they're like, do you guys know what's going on? And we're like, yes, we know. Like, please just drain this fluid so we can go home. We have an appointment on Monday with the oncologist. Like, just, we know it's going, we understand how serious this is, you know? And then what followed was 7 weeks of hell, of meeting with different doctors, trying different treatments. And Brian just declined at such an aggressively fast pace. And it was terrifying. And then he died less than 7 weeks after that night that we got those results. Wow. Yeah.
That must have been shocking, among other things.
Very shocking. Very shocking. I think that I was in shock for a year afterwards.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Like I really, and I think I partly still am, like, because once you go into that shock mode, it's so hard to get out of it. You know, like I just feel like I'm stuck and I'm scared. I often feel like I'm scared that if I let go of that little shock cover, that I will completely fall apart. And as you know, like as a widowed parent, it's so hard to actually let yourself fall apart because you need to keep it together for your kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How old was your daughter at the time, and how old is she now?
So she turned 3 2 weeks after Brian died, and she's 4.5 now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what, if anything, I guess, helped in those first, or what were those first months or first year like? You said you were in shock, but in addition to that, I guess, how else would you characterize the first period?
The first, oh gosh. So yes, shock, major shock. The way that I reacted to Brian's death was to go completely inward. Like I could not deal with other people. And I just felt like nobody understands what I'm going through. I could not even connect. Like I had serious issues with connecting to other people in our life. And I just wanted to be alone, or I just wanted to be with my daughter. I wanted to get away. So I took her and we just went to this tiny island in the Bahamas. And I just took her there and I wrote and I cried and I tried to sleep and I just tried to connect to her.
How long did you stay there?
We stayed there for 2 weeks. I wish we could have stayed there longer. I did not want to come back. But after that, I just kept going different places. So I think one of the major ways that I coped was movement, was getting away from our home, getting away from the city where we lived, where all this trauma was, spending time in nature, spending time with Brian's mom has been very helpful for me. Just taking breaks from our reality here has been very helpful. I don't know if that's healthy or not, but that's how I coped, was just spending time in other places and spending time away from the city was really, really, really helpful for me and continues to be really helpful for me. And then writing. So finding a creative outlet was super, super helpful for me.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because I think writing it's an interesting potentially tool or outlet or whatever for people who are grieving. Can you tell us a little bit about what's writing meant to you?
Yeah. And I think something that I hear a lot from other widows who reach out to me is, I wish I could write, but I can't. I try to, but I can't. And I think that sort of the caveat is, yeah, writing can be great for some people, but for some people it's not. And I don't want it to ever feel like this other burden, like, oh, if only you could write, you would feel so much better. I think if it comes naturally to you, if it feels like it helps, do it. If it feels like another thing to add to your to-do list as a widowed parent, don't do that. It's not helpful for everybody. But for me, it was not a choice. It was an instinct, and it was a survival mechanism. So I had always loved writing as a child. I always wanted to be a writer. And then as an adult, I just sort of let that part of myself go. Like I didn't listen to it. I didn't give it any airtime. I always felt like writing was sort of a skill I had that was great because it helped me in all these different parts of my life. Like it's just helpful to be a good writer. But I never thought of writing as an actual, my creative tool the way that I do now. But when Brian, I always actually had issues with like, I don't know what my creative tool is. I feel like I have this creativity in me that I don't know how to express. I always had these issues. And when Brian got sick that very first night that we got that email, I after he fell asleep, that's when I was like, oh my God, I need to write. Like it just literally came to me. And I was like, oh my God, I need to write. And as I said, like I found this old journal and I just started writing. And so writing for me has felt like it's an urge. Like I have all of these overwhelming feelings and thoughts swirling, and I don't know what to do with that. And it's just too much for me. And if I just put a pen to paper and I take those feelings and those thoughts and I just channel them into writing, it makes them feel less scary. It makes them feel less overwhelming. And then I feel like and then I read what I wrote and I'm like, I just took this thing that was so big and scary and I turned it into something beautiful and real. And that just gives my heart peace. And so that is it. I wrote so, like, as Brian was dying, I was writing. Like I was sitting beside his bed writing like feverishly. And he'd be saying things to me and I'd be like, okay, sorry, I'm listening, but I have to write this down. I need to write this down. And as he was dying, I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And I have like a full journal of writing just from the last few days of his life. Like it just got more and more, it kept growing. And it was interesting because I remember as I was writing while he was dying, I was like, I'm going to share this someday. Like this is going to be writing that I share. So it wasn't even like, part of it obviously is just for me, but there was always this feeling of like, I want to share this. And after he died, that's when I started sharing my writing on social media. And, you know, I probably should have started a blog or something, but I just didn't have the energy. I didn't have the focus. I didn't have the cognitive skills. So I was like, oh, here's this Instagram account I already have. that I can just start writing on. And that's great. And I just did that because it was like the path of least resistance. And then I started getting all this feedback from people like, wow, you're voicing these things that I feel that I don't know how to explain, or that I don't feel like I can explain, or I don't have the words for, and it's so helpful. And then that for me gave me a feeling of purpose, and like I'm able to help others. Like it felt like such a devastating blow when Brian died. I was like, what's the point of anything? What's the point of living? And I was like, it was like the writing was like a torch in the distance. I was like, here's something that I can do that I still have value. And this is something that I can actually give to the world, because I feel like I don't have anything else to give, and I will never have anything else to give. And all these things I used to feel like I had to give, I don't have the energy for anymore. I'm not a good friend anymore. I'm not really able to do my job anymore in the way I could before. All these things, all of these, like, whatever I used to think were the signposts of my life no longer are. But writing is something that it helps me and I can help others. So that's my writing story.
Yeah. Well, good. Thank you for sharing that.
No problem.
And I think that's such an important point you made right up front too. And so writing could be a thing for some people to consider, right? Does it work for you? Does it not work for you? Right? If somebody's listening to this and thinking about it, but for somebody who thinks it might be helpful to them, it's great to hear what your experience has been with it. Yeah. Cool. Good. Well, I'll link to some of your pieces in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Including the one that you read from up in the beginning. My partner, my love died, so I started writing. Okay, terrific. Well, and so let's talk a little bit about school, or maybe in your daughter's case, it's more preschool, or can you talk a little bit about that and how that's played out in the last year and a half for your daughter?
So when Brian died, our daughter was not in any sort of school or preschool or daycare, and she never had been. So this was partly because of Brian. So Brian was very adamant that he wanted to try to keep her home as much as we could. And, whether it's luck or by design, we had created this life for ourselves where we both worked for ourselves. So we were able to sort of both continue working and continue growing our career, but also take that down a notch, both take that down a notch, so that we could kind of balance both still working, not working maybe as much as we had before, but keep her at home with one of us or with my mom. So my mom took her a few days a week, Brian had her a few days a week, and I had her a few days a week. And it was this like beautiful, perfect dance that worked out really well. And that was really because of Brian. And it's interesting now, of course, because he was so adamant about it. Like that was the one thing he put his foot down about, was like, let's keep her home as long as we can. So interesting to think about now, because like, I wonder if he, somehow had some sort of feeling like he needed to spend that time with her, because he wasn't going to have that much time with her, because he got to be a primary caregiver to her the way that a lot of dads don't, but he also got to continue his career. And so when he died, I was sort of in this really difficult situation where I was like, oh, shit, this whole perfect system we had just blew apart. And he's not here. We relied on each other in this way. And I didn't want to put her all of a sudden into daycare for the first time ever, right after she's gone through this huge trauma and this huge loss. And she's so attached to me. I felt like the worst thing I could do. It would be a whole different story if she was used to school and daycare already, because then it's a safe space. And I often heard from other widows, it's like, their kids go to the daycare and the school and they get a break from like grief central at home. But that wasn't the case for my daughter. And so I was in this really difficult situation. And so I just decided I was going to keep her with me as much as I could at the beginning. I don't know if that was the right decision. So my parents helped continue to help me out and give me a little bit of breaks here and there. But it was really just the two of us for the first like 8 months. And we did a lot of traveling and we really, really connected. And then at 8 months, I decided I wanted to put her in some kind of program. And I found the perfect preschool. It was an arts-based preschool, and it was just part-time. And they just they're called the Artful Child in Toronto. I love them so much. They just understood grief. You know, the person who runs it has experience with grief, and she just got it. And she took so much extra time to allow my daughter to feel safe and heard and welcomed. They let me stick around the first few times so that she could kind of feel safe, that I was close by. They had my number in their phone. They assured her they would text me. So they really just, like, if she needed me. So they really just, oh my gosh, they were incredible. And so I feel like we just really lucked out in finding them, because they were just so incredible about her grief and about honoring her grief, and they follow my writing, and they often will say the teachers will say how appreciative they are of my writing and how much I've taught them about childhood grief, which is like so nice of them to say. But unfortunately, that was only a few months before the pandemic hit. And my daughter had these like first few beautiful months. And it's hilarious, actually, because I feel like both of us were just really starting to come into our own right before the pandemic hit. Like, I was also kind of getting out there a little bit more, like dating a bit, just kind of trying to get things moving again in my life a little bit. And so was she. And then it was like, boom, pandemic. And we were completely alone, just the two of us again. And that's been really challenging. And now, so she was supposed to start junior kindergarten in September. And I decided to keep her out for the first year. Again, because of, it's been really hard because of my situation. I had to choose between grandparents and kindergarten, because we have grandparents on both sides that are very high risk for COVID, and wouldn't be able to care for her and take care of her and be like in her bubble if she was going to school.
She was in school. Yeah.
And so I had to make that call, which again is so hard. And again, I'm like, would that call have been necessary if Brian hadn't died? How would things have been different? But that's the reality of our situation right now. And so I made that decision. And so we actually are not dealing with school right now. And she is instead spending a lot of quality time with her grandparents.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for telling us about that.
No problem.
I'd like to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about this topic of trauma and traumatic grief and traumatic loss. I know we were chatting a little bit about it before, and I think that it's an important topic, because I think that I know I certainly didn't know really that traumatic grief was different from regular grief and things before I started doing all this. So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts, experience, what you've learned about this?
I'm really actually, Jenny, just starting to delve into this as well. I think that, again, because of the shock, as we talked about it at the beginning of the show, I think for a long time I wasn't really able to access the trauma of the experience. And I think I from the very beginning, I had a very strong feeling like, I know I've been traumatized by this. I know that I experienced trauma. I knew that because I had lost memories. There are whole parts of Brian's illness that I can't remember, or that will come back to me when I'm triggered. And that's how I knew this is trauma. It's not like and of course I'm traumatized. This was an insane 7 weeks, and his body, it was like a war zone in his body. Like it was deteriorating from someone who's so healthy, who's running half marathons after dinner for fun. I mean, that was Brian, to, what happened with his body and his mind and everything it was horrific. Of course I have trauma from that. But I think that the way that it really was apparent to me was like, I knew because of the memories. And I think I was noticing there was this really great conversation around grief. And, even initially when I knew I needed counseling, I knew that, and immediately was referred for grief counseling by like everybody I knew, and found this amazing grief therapist who I loved. And she just offered this like really great safe space for me to talk about my grief. And she normalized my grief. And she was like, you're not going crazy, you're grieving, and people don't understand grief. And she gave me the words to explain to my people what I was going through. And it was amazing. but we never got into the trauma. We never, ever delved into the trauma. And it's interesting because I've now started working with a trauma therapist. And so I'm now delving into the trauma, and it is like night and day. Like it's nothing like the grief therapy that I did. And we were talking the other day and laughing together about how there's these different schools of thought. Like some people believe, well, you need to do the grief therapy first, or you need to delve into your grief first. And then once you've done that a little bit and enough time has passed, then you can get into the trauma. You actually can't get into the trauma right away when it's so fresh. But then there's this other school of thought of, well, you can't really properly grieve until you process your trauma. So it's almost like a sandwich. This is how I think of it. It's like, okay, the first year I was just like, I'm grieving, I'm surviving, I'm treading water, I'm learning about grief, I'm learning how to live as a widow, as an only parent in this crazy grief illiterate world. And now I'm doing this trauma work, and I'm delving into all of the ways that this trauma is stuck in my body, because there were all of these experiences that I had that were so overwhelming and so scary and so horrific and so traumatizing that I couldn't deal with them in the moment. I didn't have the capacity to deal with them in the moment because they were flying at me at such a quick pace. And I needed to stay grounded in that moment, because I needed to be Brian's caregiver. I needed to be a mom. I needed to keep him alive. I needed to, remember things so that I could give him his medication, so that I could talk to the doctors. Like I needed to do all of these things. I needed to remember to eat. Like I knew I needed to survive. I could not fall apart. And so all of those things were pushed away, but they're there and they're trapped. And so through this trauma therapy I'm doing now, I'm learning to safely, starting to try to safely explore, remember, feel, experience all of those insane traumatic experiences I had, and then learn to release them, which is really scary because it feels like, I'm sure you understand, as an only parent, as a widow, like you need to keep your head afloat. And so it's really scary to like open up that trauma box, because you're just like, once I open this up, can I ever close it back? Will I be able to, like it just feels like it's going to explode. And then what happens if I can't, what if I go crazy? Like I've thought about this before. I'm like, what if I remember all these things that happened and I go crazy and I can't be a mom and I can't function? Like what's going to happen if I lose my mind? Like these are the things that I think about. And so it's like, I'm already kind of thinking about, after this trauma therapy is done, I'm going to need a lot of grief therapy, because it's going to release all this new grief. And I'm going to need like a safe space where I can then just be with that, all of that extra grief that's going to continue coming up from like releasing this trauma.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I'm glad you went through this in detail, because I think a lot of people don't. Well, I'm thinking of myself, for example, a few years ago, before I started, reading all these books and talking to people, I would have kind of said, a therapist is a therapist is a therapist, right? And you could go to a therapist for any of these things that one might be struggling with, right? And so I guess, how did you know, like, grief therapist versus a trauma therapist? Like, how do you find a trauma therapist, or how do you know who to go to?
Oh gosh. So grief therapy was easy, because there's this one organization in Toronto, which is the city I live in, that's like super well known for grief therapy specifically. And they have kids grief therapists and adult grief therapists, and so many people, I know because I work in the mental health field, or I already did before all of this. So I have a lot of my friends or social workers or whatever. And so a lot of people recommended this one organization to me. And so that was great. And, grief is a small world. And when you're in the grief world, it's like all roads lead to this one place. So that was easy. The trauma therapy was a little bit harder. And I think this leads back to your question, which is that, like, your initial question, which was pointing out that, we often do think, oh, I need grief therapy, but maybe the trauma part isn't discussed as much or isn't as well known. And I think that partly has to do with, there's still a lot of stigma around mental health, and the trauma that we have been through as young widows, or that many of us have been through, is still not as openly talked. Like, okay, of course you're grieving. You need to go to a grief therapist where you can talk about your grief. But the idea that we've been traumatized by this is still a little bit more taboo. And I think a lot of widows don't want to admit that, or don't want to acknowledge that. And so the trauma therapy was trickier, actually. And I came to that myself. I really just started noticing around the 1 year mark. I started noticing, okay, my mental health isn't good. And I'm doing all these things and I'm trying to do all these things. But I noticed that these little things would trigger me. Like somebody would say something and it would just set me off. And I noticed I was having symptoms and they started coming up after the 1 year. I started noticing them a lot more because I don't know, I'm sure there's many, many reasons, but I think in part because some of the shock had worn off, in part because enough time had passed that I was sort of noticing it more because I had these expectations of myself that I wouldn't have those feelings anymore. So I was noticing that they were coming up. I was like, holy shit, I'm still so affected by these little things. And I feel like the feeling in my body is the same as when we found out Brian was sick. Like it's those same panic feelings. And so I was like, I think I need to explore trauma more. And so I started looking into all these different modalities. And actually a friend of mine, this amazing, amazing friend, made this whole list for me of all these therapists in Toronto and all the different things that they did. And I sort of just looked through, chose a few, and then called them and then used my intuition and went with one who I had a good feeling with. So that was my process.
So you call up and say, are you experienced in trauma?
Well, this is the thing, Jenny. This is the thing. And I'm sure you understand this. There's so much grief illiteracy in the world, even in the mental health field. So a few of the therapists who I talk to, they know a lot about trauma. They're super trauma informed, but they're saying all sorts of things all over the place that show how grief illiterate they are. And that was just pushing on all my buttons. And I was like, you're not a safe person. You don't understand grief. So this woman, she kind of covered all my bases, but it's hard. It's hard to find somebody good when you're in our situation because it's really complex.
Yeah. Well, and it can be exhausting to do all the research. I mean, that's great that you had a friend who made an initial list for you. That's a huge help.
Totally. And I put it off for months because I didn't have the energy to find someone. And I think I mentioned that to her and she was like, let me take that off your plate. Like that's something I can do. And I was like, this is the best gift ever. Thank you. Like, this is the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah. So for people who are listening who maybe are wondering how they can help a friend.
Yes, do that. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Or for people who are widowed parents who are listening who have people asking, how can I help? How can I help? And you're not sure, maybe something like this, you could ask a certain trusted friend to do some research on your behalf. Yeah. Great.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, thank you. I think this is a really important topic to understand and one I'd like to explore more in, my reading and in, guests on the show. And so good. So thank you for talking about this today here.
Anytime.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you a few reflection questions, if you don't mind here. I'm wondering, what do you wish you had known about widowed parenting ahead of time?
Ooh, there is something. So it took me much longer than I would have guessed to be open to other people playing an important role in my daughter's life. So let me backtrack a bit and explain this. So it took me a really long time to even acknowledge and admit that my daughter would have other adults in her life who would be more important to her because her dad died. So for example, her grandparents, some of my friends, my sister, like those people play more important roles in her life because her dad died. And for a long time, the thought of that felt really disgusting for me to even imagine. Like my initial reaction to the thought of being an only parent was that her and I would be this duo. We wouldn't really have any real emotional support from other people because no one could possibly understand, not only what we had been through, but also nobody could really understand the depth of love and connection that our little family had, the three of us when Brian was alive. So the idea of quote unquote settling for an aunt or a friend who could never love her to the depth that Brian did was horrific to me. And I still partly feel that way. And so I'm not sure if I would say that I wish I'd known or understand that it's okay for others to become a bigger part of her life over time. But I guess what I'd like to say is that it's okay if it takes a while for you to get there as a widowed parent. And it's okay also, if your kid does eventually form stronger bonds with other adults because your partner died. And that doesn't mean that their relationship with their dead parent is lessened or gone. So that was something that I wish that I had really understood a little bit more ahead of time, because I put myself through so much additional grief over that. And it was because I was scared. I was scared that if we let these other people into our lives, that lessens the importance of Brian.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So, okay. So next question is if you could go back and do anything differently. Maybe it's the same answer. I don't know. But is there anything that you wish you could go back and do differently?
I tend to not like to think about my life this way. I like to think that the way that things have happened is okay, because I can be really hard on myself otherwise. I think that I reacted as best I could given the impossible circumstances. And the message that I really try to spread through my writing and my speaking is one of self-compassion and self-love, because I think as young widows, we've been dealt a devastating blow in life. And I think we really just need to go easy on ourselves. I think that we do the best that we can do and that's enough. But one thing that I would try to do if I could do it all again, and God, who would ever want to do it all again, would be to take care of myself more and focus on my kid less. I think that early on, I became really obsessed with her grief at the beginning, especially. And I had a hard time letting anybody help me with her, because I thought, well, they're not going to understand her grief. They're not going to understand her loss. So I had trouble letting other people take care of her. I actually despised it when other people took her off my hands, even though that I desperately needed it and I desperately needed that break, because I resented the necessity of it. And if I could go back, I think I would remind myself again, one other thing, if I could go back again, I think I would remind myself again, even more, just don't give a shit about what anyone else thinks and just do your own thing, which I think I did become aware of that pretty early on, but that is one thing I would just say even more to myself if I could.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Gosh, I think we could keep talking about this all day, but let me just ask another question or two here, if you don't mind. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on some of maybe the best or the worst advice you ever got.
Okay. Yes. I'll give super, super quick answer. So the best advice I got was just give yourself grace for a long time, and then even longer. And the worst advice I got was that time heals all wounds. Hands down, worst advice. So destructive to the process of grief. Yeah.
Okay.
That's bullshit. Yeah.
And are there any surprise gotchas that you think widowed parents should look out for?
The time thing. That was the biggest mind for me, was the time thing. It just takes so much longer than you think. I literally thought when Brian died, I remember being like, oh, I'll just be sad for a year. I'm going to be devastated for a year, and then I'm going to get it out of my system and I'm going to be fine. I was so brainwashed from our grief illiterate society. I literally thought that. But the time thing still messes with me. I still have issues with how long the process is, because it's so ingrained to think that time heals all wounds, that's ingrained into us. And it's just, that's I think, just look out for the time thing and just give yourself way more time than you think.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. Well, I always like to ask my guests this wrap up question. Sure. If you could say one thing to newly widowed parents, what would you say?
I'd say hold on tight. Connect to the rest of us. I think it's incredibly affirming to find other people who get it and who won't turn away from your pain. Connecting to other widows online has been so helpful to me, and I'm grateful for every single widow who I've felt heard and seen by. And again, give yourself grace and time, and lower all expectations for yourself, and then lower them further. Ignore everyone else's advice. Connect to your own inner voice, your own inner wisdom, because you know your grief best. Yeah.
Okay, well, terrific. I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is widowed parent and grief writer, Mira Simone. So Mira, where can listeners find you if they'd like to follow you and find your writing?
So on Instagram. So I'm on Instagram at New Moon Mira, and that's where I do a lot of my grief writing. And I'm actually in the process of finally building. I'm working with an amazing web designer who I love, and we're building a website for me. So I will have a website at newmoonmira.com, hopefully very soon. I hope within the next few weeks, where I'll have more blog writing and other sorts of offerings. And I hope to have an email list where I can sort of send more things out, like tip sheets to send to people around you when you're going through grief, so that they can help support you, how to survive the first year, different sort of writing prompts and Spotify playlists for writing and all sorts of things like that. So I'm actually, I set up my email. So I hope that soon people can opt into my email list. So the email is going to be hello@newmoonmira.com. But I checked it right before coming on to this podcast today, because I was like, oh, cool, I can tell people they can sign up for my email list. And it's not working yet. I'm really bad at technology. So I hope within the next, what day is it today? November 24th that we're recording this? Is it November 24th? I hope within the next couple days, people can email me at hello@newmoonmira.com and opt into my email list. And then I hope my website is up and running very soon. But for now, Instagram is probably the best place.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, well, I'll put all the links in the show notes for sure. The link to Instagram, definitely, and then the website and the email. Because probably by the time people are hearing this, I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. All those things will be working.
Yeah.
So
yes, I hope so.
Yeah.
Also, all of my published pieces that I've written are in the link in my profile on Instagram as well.
You have a link tree there with the links to the different pieces. And yeah, terrific. Okay. Well, Mira, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me on the show, Jenny. It's been wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Mira Simone as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 95. And a big shout out today to all my listeners in Canada. It's great to have you here. Thank you for listening. Please do tell your friends about it. And let me know if there's any resources in your local communities that I should know about and potentially cover on the show. Speaking of resources, a few resources for you all this week. First of all, I want to make sure that you know about the free webinar series for caregivers that Dr. BJ Miller is doing at Mental Health. The next webinar will be March 26th, and you can find out about the series and all the information and dates at mettle.health.com/events, METTLE, health.com/events. And also, terrific article in the New York Times from Dr. Lisa Damour. It's called How to Help a Teen Out of a Homework Hole. So it's particularly talking about this pandemic and the trouble that the struggles that kids are having in school and how to help them with that. This is an article that's not grief specific. It's aimed at all parents, so check that out. And finally, wanted to make sure you guys know about a unique and really cool service. It's called Grief Coach, and it is grief support by text messaging. And they actually will deliver tips and other kinds of support for a whole year. It's a subscription. And you can also set it up so that some of your friends or family members, your supporters, can get information and reminders and tips on ways to support you and ways to be a good ally to you, the grieving person. So check that out. Their website is grief.coach, and I've actually got a discount for my listeners. It's an affiliate link, so I get a small commission if you sign up, and you get a discount. So it's a win-win. The code is Jenny Lisk, all one word, JENNYLISK. So I will put links to all three of these resources in the email that's going out this week and also in this week's blog post. So if you're not on my email list, make sure you're there. Make sure you sign up so that you can get these resources and links and find out about the new episodes in the future. And if you just want to hop over and find these links, right now, you can go to my website, jennylisk.com, and go to the menu for the blog posts, and you'll find it there. And one more thing, remember, there's a special discount for listeners of the show. If you're interested in Future Widow, my memoir, which came out just last month, well, actually it's March now, so it came out in January. If you're interested in the ebook, you can go to futurewidowbook.com and look for the button that says buy the ebook directly from the author. And when you go over to the PayHip store, you can use the special code at checkout, which is listener15, and save 15% on the ebook. And lots of terrific reviews have been coming in on the book, so thank you to everyone who's reviewed it. And if you haven't yet, please do so. I've got some tips at jennylisk.com/review. Okay, all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.